So, as I understand it, the reason that I'm here today is to talk about the kind of work I did in the past to provide assistance to parliaments and legislatures. And so I will try to make some sense of that based on my own experience, and we'll see how we do. So, the beginning, I worked for a long time in the United States Congress. It's quite different from a parliament because the way that the U.S. government is established by the U.S. Constitution is different from any European structure. However, there are quite a lot of similarities between the U.S. Congress and any other parliament in that they are both the legislative branch of government. So after working in the legislative branch of government in my own mother country for 10 years, I then worked in the civil society for another 10 years, and I worked again with the legislature. So with that experience from two sides, from within the lawmaking body and from the organized civil society trying to influence policy making by working with the legislature, I took that 20 years of experience and then I went to work for NDI. And at the time, and I think still today, NDI was an assistance organization. There are many such organizations, and I was brought in to do parliamentary assistance work. So what is that? So a parliamentary assistance program is what it's supposed to sound like. It's to help parliaments become stronger institutions. And the reason for that is that the concept behind that is that legislatures have an important and a unique role in the functioning of societies, of organized societies, and particularly within democratic societies. So there are a number of organizations that work to establish parliamentary assistance programs and to help legislatures become stronger institutions within their governments. Organizations like the United Nations, the OSCE. There's a particularly nice one, I think, based in Sweden called International IDEA, which is International Democracy and Education Assistance, something like that. There's a lot of these groups. NDI is one of them. And the aim is better functioning government through strengthened institutions. So an institution of government might be the executive branch or the legislative branch or the judicial branch. Those are the main ones. There is generally acknowledged to be the fourth branch of government, which is the public. Whether it's individuals or organized civil society groups, the point of the government, as we see it, is the better interaction with people and representation of people. And that is the germ of the idea behind a functioning legislature, that people's ideas will be represented in the policymaking process. So that was the concept underlying parliamentary assistance programs, and I worked on many of them. The most important thing about a legislature, whether it's an organized parliament with multiple parties in it or whether it's a U.S. Congress type with only two parties in it, the most important function is to establish fair process by which people's opinions can be entered into the policy-making process. And that doesn't mean mob rule. That doesn't mean majority every time. What it means is that there's a process for a fair consideration of multiple points of view. And this is really the function of a legislature, to make sure that people are represented fairly, to make sure that government policies are responsive to the needs of the people. After all, the people are electing the parliaments. That's their point. So the Parliamentary Assistance Program anyone, all of them, recognize the unique functions of legislatures. And here's where the legislative branch of government is very, very different from the executive branch, very different from the judicial branch. The legislatures have a right and a responsibility to conduct oversight. That means they have the legitimate role to play in making sure that government is functioning as a representative of the people. That oversight role is not necessarily played by the executive branch. In any number of governments around the world, you'll see that presidents or prime ministers, they're allotted a great deal of power to make decisions, to create laws, to make budgets, to appoint ministers, to appoint functionary leadership in all of the executive agencies, all of the branches of government, all the ministries. That's what the executive has the right to do. But the legislative branch, the Congress or the Parliament, they have to make sure those processes are fair, those people are competent. They have to ensure that government funds are used for government purposes, not diverted through corruption, for example. Legislatures have a very important role that nobody else has. It's what I call as the talk shop. They have the right to, and they have the very important responsibility to create debate around policies. All this goes to policy development, where the budget is allocated, more money for the military or more money for healthcare, more money for schools or for transportation. Sometimes, and many times, I think, within legislatures, there are competing priorities, and all the priorities have legitimacy, but there isn't always enough money to go around, there aren't enough people, there aren't enough resources to take care of everything. So it's a question of priorities. And how priorities are determined is the basis of what we would call government policies. And the legislature's role in this policy development is unique. No other organization or institution in a government can function like this simply because the executive branch has a lot of power to make appointments and control ministries. So it's difficult, if not impossible, for a ministry to disagree with what is instructions that are coming from the executive branch. The minister is appointed by the prime minister. The appointees in the ministry are made from the executive branch. Everyone is stepping in line, and they may be promoting a policy for any number of reasons. They may be promoting a policy that overlooks a certain part of the population or ignores the needs of women or children or some other important group or important part of the citizenry. And it's the legislature that has the responsibility in this talk shop function to bring these issues to light. And so the legislature's role in policy development is unique and irreplaceable. And the legislature has to have procedures for examining policies. So part of a parliamentary assistance program is to provide models for legislatures to create these procedures. For example, I can speak from my own experience. In the US Congress, it's an old body, and there are very old and established procedures and lots of rules, hundreds of pages of rules of what's called legislative procedure that governs every aspect of the functioning many European parliaments have similar rules, and some of the parliaments that I worked with in countries of the former Soviet Union also have these quite distinct and detailed books of rules about how things are done. In some places, people follow the rules better than in other places. But the point is generally the same, that legislatures, to function, have to have rules, and to a pretty large extent, they must follow their own rules. And why do they do that? They do that, I think, to be fair, because being fair establishes their legitimacy. It makes them credible institutions in a functioning government, in a functioning democratic government. The fairness and legitimacy role of the legislature can never be understated. It is the key, and again, it goes to what makes the legislature unique in any government. The legislatures are meant to represent the people. They represent the people because members of parliament or members of Congress are elected by the people. It is the direct election of these people that establishes an unbreakable bond between the members of parliament and their constituencies, their citizens. That representative function is not fulfilled by any other branch of government. The courts are meant to be fair and impartial and follow the rules laid down in a country's constitution or other main laws. The executive branch is also meant to be fair and reasonable, and of course they have to be reelected. In a democratic situation, you will have the executive branch running for election every 2 years or 4 or 5 or 7, whatever the term is. The prime minister has to run again, and that's of course the ultimate test of how representative they are. If you assume that elections are basically fair, and you cannot assume that everywhere, but you want to, that's another area for these international organizations like the UN. That's another area they work a lot in fair elections. I did some of that work myself. But if you assume that the elections are fair, then you have the executive branch facing the people in elections, but more frequently you have the legislative branch. So it's this link is the strongest link there between people and that branch of government. So the people's representation is the existence, is the reason for existence for a legislature. And how they do it is through these rules of procedure. So in a parliamentary assistance program, I'll divert here to a little bit of how one is established. So I've given you why. Next, I'm going to cover a little bit of how and what it means. So to make a legislature stronger, the main concept is to make it more representative, to make sure that the rules are established so that the legislature can fulfill its role and function, this representative role, this link to people. It's not easy to do that. One of the things that I saw a lot of, both in my work in the United States Congress and in my work with many other legislatures, some of which were brand new, was how different it is to be the individual who's elected. You run for office, you know people, you run a campaign, you meet a lot of people, you chase those votes, you're out there every day talking about things that matters, and fantastic, you've gotten elected. And then you go to the Capitol and you enter this enormous stone building and you have no idea what to do. In some of the countries where I worked, particularly in the former Soviet Union, this was a habitual situation. People thought of their member of parliament as someone who was meant to help them, which it is, but they asked for help in ways that according to a parliamentary assistance program, ways that weren't appropriate. For example, my nephew needs a job. My neighbor is bothering me. That's my farm, not his farm. Do something for me because I sent you there. That's the kind of question that comes a lot. And even when I worked in the U.S. Congress, we used to get a lot of contacts from constituents. From my first boss was a congressman from the state of New Jersey. And we used to get a lot of letters from people and phone calls from the constituency, from the district. These are people who either vote for my boss or don't. So it's very important to respond to their needs, to make them understand that they are being listened to, that they are being treated with respect. I can't tell you how many letters I opened myself from constituents saying, my neighbor's dog poops in my yard. Whoops. I mean, there is no act of Congress that will change that. There is absolutely no place for that, but there is this problem presented that the constituent has taken the time to contact the congressman, so you can't really say, you know what, this isn't my problem. And this kind of situation, whether it's the dog in New Jersey or the leader of a large community in another country, this kind of situation arises a lot, where someone is demanding answers from a parliamentarian to questions that really don't belong in Parliament. And so one of the goals of the Parliamentary Assistance Program is to discuss within the context of a parliament what the legislature is there to do and what they're not there to do. And that kind of education and training is very helpful to the legislators who otherwise really don't have a good way of handling these requests. The legislator comes to the Capitol, newly elected, and suddenly it's a totally different environment from how it was at home and how it was during the election campaign. So one of the things that a lot of parliamentary assistance programs work on is what we call the orientation for new members of Congress. I can tell you in the U.S. Congress, which has a 200-year experience of trying to get this stuff right, there is orientation for new members of Congress. It used to be, when I was there a long time ago, it was conducted by the Library of Congress. Everybody went away to a secret location. Congressmen only, no staff, absolutely, and congresswomen, obviously. And they spent a week learning how to work in the Congress. These are people who are elected. They have got there. They have political savvy. Many of them came from other elected offices in state houses or sometimes governors. There are a lot of people with political experience, enormous political experience. And of course, they've all run and won at least one campaign. And most people in the States, anyway, most people who are elected are not elected the first time they run. That's unusual. So they've run more than one campaign. They know about getting people around them. They know about discussing issues. They know about meeting people. They know about raising money. They know about political advertising. They know a lot. But when they get to Congress, they don't know how to work in the Congress because it's all really, really different. And they go away for a week and they learn how to do it. From everything to selecting your office and choosing your computer systems and setting up your what we call constituent offices. That's offices in your home state or your home counties or your home territories, whatever it is. Everything from that to how to choose how you spend your time, which is basically what issues you're going to work on. You can't work on everything. You won't have time. So the issues that are worked on, this is about policies. Do you really want to work on healthcare, or do you really want to work on defense, or do you really want to work on agriculture? or maritime issues. I mean, there are space issues. There are so many issues. And to work effectively, a member of parliament has to develop a certain amount of expertise. So they have to focus their efforts. And in most legislatures, these issues are represented in committee structures. So committees are the subunits of a Congress or a parliament. Generally, committees are established to work on a bunch of related issues, like energy and trade, or defense, that's always a big one, or health, education, welfare. These are kind of groups of issues that the parliament will look at in more depth. And because it's a reality that not everyone can do everything all day long, they divvy up the work and they divide it amongst the various committees. So the committees will have expertise in certain areas, and that's what they do. And the new members of parliament have to choose, and sometimes they don't get the choice that they wanted, but they will have to serve on committees. This is very typical in every legislature I've ever encountered. There are specialty units within the legislature. These are the committees. And the committees are usually divided into subcommittees. So it's another layer down with a smaller assignment going more in depth. I read a long time ago, it was a political cartoon where they were talking about the U.S. Congress, and somebody mentioned the committee and its subcommittee on fishing rods. So there's some guy throwing his fishing line into a river, and this was what they did on the subcommittee on fishing rods. But the reality behind that is that it's a specialization, as anyone who's ever worked or been in a university context will know as well, that there are specializations and subspecializations and sub-subspecializations. And this is one of the roles of legislatures in having committees. They want to be very good at developing policies, and so they break it down to broader groups like health, education, and welfare. This is an area that I worked on, so I mentioned that as a topic. And within that, there's going to be a subcommittee that only does health. And there's going to be a different one that only looks at education. And maybe within that, there will be even a smaller group that's only looking at elementary education. Or there will be another group that's looking at higher education. So these divisions and subdivisions are useful in the policy process. And when we think about a parliamentary assistance program, we think about how to help legislatures establish, they have to make their own decisions, but establish processes and structures that will organize the work that they need to do. So this is where you get to the committee process and the development of subcommittees. Now, I'm going to stick with committees as a mechanism because the committee function is a main mechanism of the legislature. The role of a committee should be to develop policy by looking very carefully at alternatives, by researching and bringing in outside experts. For example, there might be teachers' unions that have organized themselves around education issues. And so if the Committee on Health, Education, and Welfare is looking at new laws in the legislation, in the education sector, they may want to have a committee hearing, a public hearing. This is very, very important part of what a legislature can do. And it was a big focus of legislative assistance programs that I worked on, helping legislatures divide their work and figure out how to carry out their work so that they could be representative of people and that they could develop good policies. when they develop their policies, they have some time to look at issues in depth. And how they do that in a representative fashion is they do it openly. We call this in the States, we call it the sunshine. In a lot of parliaments, there are laws about this. In a lot of countries, there are laws about this. Opening up the process, the political process, so it doesn't happen mysteriously. The legislature is the people's representative body. So what they do should involve people. But you don't want to have everything in the open Roman theater with thousands of people screaming and yelling. You have to have a more organized process. So this is what legislatures can do. They can establish their structures with their committees or something like that to examine issues. And one of the main mechanisms that many of them use is the hearing process. And most of the hearings are conducted in public. There might be small rooms like this one. Not everyone can get in. There might be an invitation process. There might be some kind of ticketing process, first come, first served. You know, when there's seats in the room, somebody can come in. There are rules for the conduct of hearings. There are many rules. The audience doesn't talk, for one. And these are generally well organized in advance by staff. It's something else that members of parliament, most of them have some staff working for them, some professional staff, either working with them in the Capitol or working back home, or both. And that's one of the topics for our parliamentary assistance program is staffing an office. That goes directly to another very important role in the parliament's function, which is the parliament's budget. In some of the countries I worked in, the executive branch had control of all of parliament's money. I worked in one parliament where the government controlled the money, and the members of parliament who were obedient got bigger offices, they got more money, they got more staff. And the ones who were not obedient, I worked with one woman. She was sitting in a very small, cold room. It was so cold in there. There was no heat. That was what she got for not being obedient. You know, so these are the realities in some, let me say, harsher places. That wasn't here, obviously. But this kind of issue, it's easy to say, oh, okay, we'll have a legislature, but when it comes down to the details, one of the important details for legislatures is having control over some of their own money. And the fair division between the majority and any minority groups, whatever they may be, whether it's a political party that's in minority or whether it's some kind of other less formal organization, like, for example, a women's caucus, or one of the groups I worked on when I worked in the U.S. Congress was a rural caucus. So I worked for a senator from a really big state with very small population, very rural state. And there were a lot of issues there that were in common with other rural states or rural areas in larger states. Like you've probably all heard of New York City, even if you haven't been there. Most of New York is actually rural. So these are very low population places where it's hard to get services, and it's hard to fix the roads, and it's hard to provide enough hospitals or schools, things like this. Very important to rural areas. It's a different set of policy problems that you face in rural areas. So when I was there way back when, we had a rural caucus, and it wasn't just rural, it was subdivided. It was a rural health caucus. We worked on health issues in rural areas. So in the context of a parliamentary assistance program, I didn't talk about that so much, but what we did do in a number of legislatures was help them establish these informal working groups, like caucuses, where some members of parliament might have issues in common, some of them, and they could get together sometimes on those issues to inform each other or work together.